right, you undaunted Herle Burlyites. Despite my best efforts to disappoint you here week after week, you keep coming back for more of these interviews. And for that, I'm grateful. I'm particularly grateful for reviews like this one from Peter 195,300 on Apple Podcasts. Great interviews, topics that are timely, and interesting, knowledgeable guests. We often get to know the guests in a whole new way. Honestly, that means a hell of a lot to me. Thank you for that, sir. You may be Peter 195,300 to Apple, but you just made Herle Burly's top 10 list of worldwide Peters. Peter Jackson's on that list too. Peter Navarro is not. Anyway, this week on the pod, our thoughts turn to the events in Europe, and we are honored to have Sabine Sparwasser here with us. Ms. Sparwasser has been the Federal Republic of Germany's ambassador to Canada since 2017. Just prior to that, she was Germany's special representative of the federal government for Afghanistan and Pakistan. And if I reach way back into her bio, she started her career as a journalist for German television. Today, we're going to talk about the war in Ukraine generally, and more specifically with respect to Germany, the huge policy shifts the country's made recently with respect to military buildup and nuclear power. Then we'll discuss the strain on the EU in the light of Brexit in Ukraine and Germany's pivotal role within that political and economic union. Sabine Sparwasser, welcome to the Herle Burly. I'm so glad that we could do this together, that you could join us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
How are you?
I'm fine. We're starting to be very busy again, but I do believe that for all of us, and in particular even more so in Europe, the war in Ukraine has really preoccupied everybody. It's on everybody's mind. And I think the 24th of February 2022 will go down in history with other big dates that you never forget.
Right. Interesting. Can I ask you, before we get into it, a little bit about your background? What part of Germany are you from, and what kind of upbringing did you have?
Yeah, I grew up in Rhineland, Koblenz. So imagine the Mosel and the Rhine coming together, surrounded by lots of hills where fantastic Rieslings are being grown. So that was a big part of my upbringing. That's where I went to school. That's where my family still lives. And it is this part of Germany, in the middle of Germany, that has a reputation for being very easygoing and forthcoming. So the Rhinelanders have seen it all. They've seen the Romans, they've seen the French, they've seen it all, and they got along with everybody.
What was the path that you were on that got you to diplomacy?
I moved on from studying in Germany, then I moved on to studying Sciences Po in Paris. And I, during that time, worked in particular for two professors, both Jewish professors, both German Jews, who worked very hard for German-French reconciliation and German-Jewish reconciliation. And I think that was a watershed for me. Working for them, working with them, motivated me to apply for the diplomatic service. But I have to say, you started off by saying that I worked in journalism. I actually wanted to become a journalist. I'm a failed journalist because at the time when my university was finished, there were no jobs in journalism. They had a sudden freeze. And so that's when I decided it has to be with politics, it has to be international. And so I went into the Foreign Service exam.
Well, I think you made the right call there in terms of influence and making a difference in the things you care about.
I've wondered about that many times. Very often you find that, a good article, a good journalist will influence things more than all the submissions I write as a civil servant. But
there's that. Yeah. There is that. Yeah. So, before we get into the events since Putin's invasion, I want to go back to something that everybody's seemingly forgotten, just because I'm curious. I want to start with COVID. What's the state of COVID in Germany at the present time?
Yeah, numbers are pretty high, at a very high level, but they're going down a little bit. So we're at a point where we had huge numbers of Omicron, in particular in Germany. And I think by now the government realizes that we need to do what we can to protect the vulnerable people. We need to increase the vaccination rates, and we basically need to look at hospitalization rates and make sure our health system isn't being overwhelmed. But in many ways, we're going back to a more normal life with fewer restrictions, just because the activity, the economic activity in Germany was very restrained during certain times. And also, this is so contagious, but fortunately less harmful as an infection now, so that people think we can manage this way. I think it's very similar basically to what Canada is going through and has been all along.
Did Germany do anything different than Canada did?
We had the same issues with, we do have something different, unfortunately. I think the Canadian vaccination rate is much higher. The Canadians have been very good about getting vaccinated, whereas in Germany, I think our vaccination rate is still at 65 or so, which is not as good. We've had the same kind of carpet, if you want, sort of patchwork carpet on because we're also a federal system. So different jurisdictions had different measures. That made it very confusing. We never did know whether what you could do in which province in Germany. But right now we're debating also whether we should have an obligation to vaccinate. There is going to be a debate in Parliament. Again, the country, the opinions quite divided about it. They may end up with coming out with a vaccination obligation for the vulnerable groups in order to protect them better. But it may be a very different turnout. Same debates as in Canada, quite similar, I think, approach. What was interesting was, and this is a point not so known on COVID, Canada and Europe worked very, very closely together when the vaccinations came out. And I think it's worth saying that the first vaccine, the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine on the market, came out of Germany and was produced in Europe. And the Canadian supply in the first month when the vaccination was happening came to virtually 100% from Europe. So I felt that this was also, it was showing how close we are and how much we can rely upon each other.
Germany is known as a social democratic society. In Canada, when the lockdown happened, the government introduced something called the CERB, which was basically a $2,000 income supplement for anybody who needed it. Just apply and you get it. Did Germany have something similar to that?
Yeah, we had massive supports for companies. We had massive supports for people, send them into short working hours, send them into home office, supply the companies or people directly with the money to get through that very difficult phase. So we have done exactly the same kind of measures as Canada did. And the result is that we're coming out with unemployment numbers not too bad. The economic activity has recovered, is now, that's a different thing under the Ukraine shock. So that's going to be a very different thing. But I think the supports we gave to people to come through the pandemic, and in particular, the supports we gave to small and medium-sized companies to ride the tide were crucial.
Right, right. What do you attribute vaccine resistance to?
I don't know. You see, you think the country of Einstein and Kant and people would be very, very rational. But it is true that in Germany we have a history of vaccine resistance, and we have a history also of a part of the population that is believes in obscurantism, and we have now also a political party that has 12% in parliament. That is a very libertarian party, xenophobic party, and tends to believe in conspiracy theories. And this party has taken on the anti-vaxxer kind of concept. So it's a mix. It's a mix. And you see these demonstrations of anti-vaxxers, and you do have very different people in there. You have people from the extreme left, people from the extreme right, you have conspiracy theorists, you have what we call the aluminium heads. These are people who think they're rays coming down.
Yeah, for sure.
From the sky.
Yeah, tinfoil hats, we call them here.
Tinfoil hats, exactly.
Yeah, tinfoil hats, yeah.
You have people who are sort of more on the homeopathic side. It's a huge mix, and that has led to Germany not having as high a vaccination rate, unfortunately.
It feels to me, neither you nor I are experts in this, presumably, but certainly I'm not. It seems to me that when the vaccines were preventing reinfection, then you could make a strong case for mandatory vaccination. But now that they don't prevent you from getting or spreading Omicron, it seems more difficult to make a case for mandatory vaccination.
Yeah, I think that's the case. That's the case. And the debate of mandatory vaccination started before the reinfections came up. And I think it has weakened the argument. I still think there may be a case to be made for not an obligation that you enforce by police, but sort of an obligation where you say the law is that people above 50 or 60 get vaccinated, because it does protect. It really does protect. And in many ways, if you look at it, if I look at my kids probably could have gotten infected earlier and they wouldn't have suffered so much. The fact that they accepted those restrictions, the young people accepted the restrictions for all us older ones, was an act of solidarity. But I think it would be an act of solidarity of the older population to say we're all getting vaccinated so that life can become much more normal again, also for the younger people.
I'll take all the German Pfizer that you can give me. Okay, yeah. I've got 2 British AstraZeneca in me, which is like wearing a condom with a hole in it, right? It's like useless. So
I think they actually say the mix is really good. If you have a bit of Pfizer, a bit of AstraZeneca, etc., I think you're probably better protected by that.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm skeptical. They say AstraZeneca is worthless unless you combine it with something, and then it's tremendous. I don't know. I feel like I want more Pfizer in me.
Okay.
Okay, let's talk about the big news of the day. And, you know, Germany, it's been amazing what's happened since Putin's invasion. Because, you know, I went back and I read discussions that were going on between the governing coalition partners after the election. And, you know, you had some parties that are part of the coalition that really wanted spending restraint. You had some parts of the coalition that really wanted less emphasis on the military and on spending in that area. You had, you know, obviously advocates of Russian gas in that coalition. So, you know, for that government to turn around and make the policy shifts it has is pretty remarkable. But maybe I could ask you to set some context for us. Before Putin's invasion of Ukraine, What was the German mentality regarding the military and the use of the military?
Germany has, I think, a very strong pacifistic streak, and for very good reasons. In many ways, if you were to ask people sort of in confidence, wouldn't it be nice if Germany could be a large Switzerland? A lot of people would say, this is nice, you know, you don't participate. At the same time, it's totally impossible because Germany is this large and important country in the middle of Europe, and being part of NATO and being a very strong part of NATO has been crucial in maintaining peace for so long, up to now. The 24th of February is a real watershed for us. And it was, as you say, the Chancellor who 2 days later, I think 3 days later on a Sunday, convened, or the Parliament convened, and the Chancellor stepped forwards. And in 20 minutes, in a very sober but very straight speech, he sort of changed our foreign and security policy 180 degrees. So instead of being dependent on Russian gas, we're cutting Nord Stream 2, and we're trying to get out of the dependency. We are not going to just meet the 2% target of GDP for defense spending. We're doing more than that. We set aside a special 100 billion fund in order to beef up the equipment for German and European military in order to produce or give us better security and better abilities in Europe. It was this is a huge change, and he said, we have seen that the times have changed. War is back in Europe. We need to change. And the other changes he announced, and again, you said this government had started with the wish to be fiscally responsible, not to overspend. So we have 100 billion now committed to military spending and equipment, and the finance minister, who had promised to be very, very tight with money, basically said we're committing 220 billion to get out of the dependency. We will build renewable energy. We will build our own infrastructure. We will build with other partners. And he basically said, this is the price of freedom.
Throw up a hand if, during the past couple of years, you've had a doctor's appointment virtually. It's a lot of us. There's been no other choice, really. We all know why. Well, a virtual check-in with your doctor during a pandemic is one thing. Having an MRI or CT scan come to you, or being monitored for a condition in real time by a specialist who's in one place while you're at home, is another. All of these things are coming, Herle Burlyites, with the continuing evolution of 5G and 5G-enabled healthcare technology. And it's a key reason our presenting sponsor, TELUS, believes getting 5G wireless connectivity right across all of Canada, not just our biggest cities, but all rural, remote, and Indigenous communities, is critical to delivering public health care in a way that's equitable for all Canadians. This is Chapter 10 in our 5G story. Healthcare is a shared Canadian value, eh? Simply put, shared means we all have something in common, and practically speaking, that everyone has access to it. Well, with these innovations coming down the line, and other technologies that impact health and public safety, think about fully connected ambulances that pre-treat remotely, with multi-layer diagnostic imaging on board, connected to emergency room doctors, so they can develop a proper treatment plan before the patient even arrives. Access to 5G is critical. Just one problem. Only 37% of rural Canada has any kind of high-speed connectivity at all. Nothing equitable or shared about that. The sad fact is, too many carriers are failing to build networks in rural communities, putting a big kink in our healthcare delivery chain. But TELUS is building, and they're fighting for policies that accelerate rural builds. Because, as a technology company with social purpose, TELUS knows the faster we get 5G to everyone in Canada, the more equitable our healthcare system becomes. We're going to wrap up this whole story next week, but you can have your say right now at telus.com/get5G-right. I'm not a diplomat, and so I hope I don't offend you with these questions, but the pacifist nature of German society since the Second World War, was that a self-imposed restraint, or was Germany afraid of itself if it was armed, or what was behind that post-Second World War pacifism?
Yeah, I think there are many elements. Part of it is war trauma. And, we've grown up still living in rubble. I mean, where I come from in the Rhineland, we still played in the rubble of houses that had imploded. My mother, for example, was a refugee from Silesia. So there was that very, very strong feeling, never war again. And certainly, if you want to define German foreign and defense policy, basically said never again, with a view also to what we did in the Holocaust, and never alone. And that was the other idea. We will always be together with our partners and neighbors. We will be within the EU. We will be with NATO. We will never do anything alone. It also, I have to say, was probably comfortable to be peaceful and not to have to engage. And neighbors have sort of said to us, you could commit more, you could do more. You should take on greater responsibility. And famously, it was a Polish foreign minister of all, Poland, who had been invaded by Germany, who said, I'm not afraid of Germany taking on too much responsibility. I'm afraid of Germany taking on too little. And so that was a sea change maybe in the last 10 years, where the demand, or 20 years, let's say, where the demands on Germany were getting higher, and we were committing. Kosovo and the Balkan Wars were the big breaking point there. And it was, of all places, it was a Green foreign minister from the very pacifistic Green Party who had to lead the effort and said, we cannot watch genocide happening. We cannot watch this. We need to protect those people. And basically it led to Germany for the first time going militarily in with NATO. And ironically, again, today, it is a red-green and liberal government, but a government with the parties that have the strong pacifist streak, who now need to lead that total change in security policy in Germany and say, oh, yes, we are delivering weapons into a conflict zone. And we are doing it, and we are doing it massively. As we speak today, I got new numbers. Germany is delivering a lot of material now steadily to Ukraine.
Great. So, I mean, this is happening now for the best of reasons. But you know the German people and the German psyche as well as anybody I'm ever going to speak to in my life. So I need to ask you, is there any reason for a person to be unsettled about Germany rearming and becoming a military power?
I don't think so. I think it's actually, it's one of the most amazing changes, and it shows how much Germany has changed since World War II, that now our partners surrounding us are not in the least frightened of Germany rearming. They're asking us to do it. It's been welcomed all around. And I do believe that Germany is so integrated and so closely interlinked within Europe and within NATO. And the German psyche is much, in its tendency, much more towards pacifism than actually being very militaristic. I don't think you have to worry about that.
Excellent. I'll go back to worrying about North Korea. So for obvious reasons, another wave of Ukrainian immigrants is headed to Canada. Their reason for leaving Ukraine is tragic, but their arrival here is a very good thing for the country. Previous waves of humanity from Ukraine literally helped build and farm Western Canada. Talk about a contribution, and talk about a cultural force. Think former Gigi Raynatian, or former Supreme Court Justice John Sopinka. Think former Premiers Roy Romano, Gary Filmon, Ed Stelmach. Think William Shatner, Roberta Bondar, Randy Bachman. There have been enough Ukrainian-Canadian NHL players to form their own team. Gretzky, Eddie Shack, Terry Sawchuk, Mike Bossy, Vic Stasiak, and so many others. The size and distinctiveness of the Ukrainian-Canadian community, the biggest outside Russia and Ukraine itself, was a major reason for Canada's embrace of multiculturalism as an official national policy more than 50 years ago. Today, there are about 1.5 million Canadians who identify as Ukrainian. Many of them are here because their ancestors escaped repression and genocide. And now, once again, Ukrainians are fleeing their homeland for the same reason. Thousands have already arrived in Canada. Millions more are refugees in Europe. And they need help. Our sponsor, CN, has a long history with the Ukrainian-Canadian communities, particularly along its network in the prairie provinces. Many of its pensioners, employees, and stakeholders here and in the United States are of Ukrainian descent. Those communities are deeply involved in humanitarian efforts now underway here and in Eastern Europe, and CN wanted to help. So the railway has donated $1.1 million to the Ukrainian-Canadian Foundation, as well to Raison, a sister organization in the U.S. The money will help pay for resettlement, shelter, and food, and for badly needed medical supplies within Ukraine. Further, CN has pledged to match donations made by its employees and pensioners. If you're like me, you've been watching the news from Ukraine with a feeling of helplessness. Well, you know how you can help? Money can help. Vast relief efforts are originating in Canada. There's no better cause. American leadership, it's been pretty strong on Ukraine, depending on your perspective, but it's been pretty strong on Ukraine. But it feels, obviously, for obvious reasons, more uncertain than it did decades ago. And is that a reason why Germany has to step up? And is there an additional leadership role that Germany's going to end up playing, do you think, in the NATO alliance?
Yeah, I mean, two aspects, but I think definitely under President Biden, America has taken, thank God, has taken very strong leadership. And honestly, to have a NATO that was called brain dead by President Macron, to be as united, as dynamic in this is really due to very strong and very skilled leadership.
And we can both imagine the opposite, right?
Oh, yeah. And also the commitment that the Americans are showing to be there and not to be isolationist or not to go out. I mean, if you look at it, Putin probably had a few targets in attacking Ukraine, but the sort of long-term target is get the Americans out of Europe. Well, I think he's achieved the opposite. The other target, weakening NATO, I think, again, the opposite has happened. And so in many ways, NATO and the US-Europe relationship has never been stronger than now. So it's in that sense, it's a huge benefit. Do we need a stronger European pillar in all of that? Yes, because this is a European conflict, and we need to actually do our bit more, and we need to do our bit more with paying the 2%. We need to do our bit more with being much more compatible with each other. We need to have better equipment that is not sort of designed by each and every country themselves. We have started with European battle groups. We are working together, but we also will make it easier for the Americans to stay, and we'll be more interesting partners as a European Union if we actually manage to beef up our military and security presence. And again, if anything, this has happened through the shock of Ukraine. And this is advancing so much faster because of Ukraine.
Right. When Trump was in office and talking about NATO almost in the past tense, and really raising questions about how strongly America could be relied on as part of the NATO alliance, what kind of contingencies were European countries thinking about?
Well, I think we were worried about that. And we were thinking about beefing up the European pillar and making it stronger. But, these things take time, and we're nowhere near, and nobody wants to replace. The Americans are in NATO, they are irreplaceable, the irreplaceable nation, as the late and much, much mourned Madeleine Albright said. We will have to do much more. We will have to do much more, and we will step up to the plate.
Okay. So for decades, for both economic and political reasons, Germany has tried to have normal relations with with Russia. Germany's tried to have normal, open relations with Russia, no matter how bad things were between Russia and the United States. Germany had a dialogue. What is so egregious about Ukraine that forced Germany to turn its back on that approach and confront Putin?
Yeah, I think actually I would start off by saying we got it wrong, and we're standing in front of sort of the ruins of a policy we believed in very closely. Russia's our next door neighbor. Germany owes much to Russia. I mean, we brought devastation to the Soviet Union. That includes Ukraine, obviously, at the time. During World War II, we owe a debt to Russia because of unification. Without Gorbachev, the Russian consent, we would have never seen that wonderful moment. So we always believed we should create a security system in Europe that would include and integrate and invite Russia in. And, if you look at sort of the time of the fall of the wall, then even the transition from Yeltsin to Putin in the sort of 2000, we believed that Russia would sort of get closer to NATO. We even talked about it becoming a part of NATO. We signed a fundamental act of cooperation between Russia and NATO. Putin stood in the German Bundestag, gave a speech in perfect German, where he said he wanted to get integrated into that European system. We wanted to believe it. We wanted this to happen. And I think we ignored the signs that were coming over the years far too much, that Russia actually wasn't going in this direction, that it was going in the opposite direction. We should have looked close at Chechnya. We should have looked close at what happened in Georgia. But latest in 2014, with the Eastern Ukraine and Crimea, we should have heard the shot. We did hear it up to a point, and after Crimea, we did go to sanctions. We did beef up our defenses in the eastern flank, NATO eastern flank. But I don't think we quite realized that this wasn't it. You know, people always thought, oh, this is it. This is bad, but this is it. And then we can try and negotiate away. And the Minsk agreement was a way of trying to negotiate. But it didn't, the ambition didn't stop there. And I've heard of people, colleagues of mine, you know, older colleagues, younger colleagues, who have been working on integrating Russia, on negotiating with Russia, who on that day when Russia really attacked, they were crying. They were sitting there crying and saying, this is everything we've tried is gone to waste.
Why hasn't it been obvious that Putin is an empire builder for a long time?
Why hasn't it been obvious? Yeah. Well, I think 2014 was certainly the moment. Up to then, there was nothing where that really triggered the West to think we can't do business with them. I think it's also, and I think we're actually thinking that we need to redo our security strategy, but also our thinking. I mean, even seasoned diplomats, at some points, you'd always give in to wishful thinking. You always think, oh, we want to have a negotiated agreement. You know, they're very good. Look at Syria, for example, in the Russian position on Syria. Russia has always then allowed negotiation to take place, and everybody always hopes the negotiation is going to do something. But at the same time, it allowed it to continue with its military action, and the negotiation went nowhere. So we were, I do believe we have to be very self-critical and understand how we failed to recognize the signs.
Well, I mean, Sabine, it's so interesting, the business you're in, because you've put your finger on what seems to me as a layperson to be the essential conundrum is, when do you know that Neville Chamberlain is wrong?
Yeah.
Right? He's not always wrong.
Yeah.
When do you know that Neville Chamberlain is wrong?
And that's in hindsight. You only know in hindsight. And that is, but it's devastating when it's as consequential as this was, right?
Right.
And I think we'll now see huge consequences for the foreseeable future for the European security structure, for NATO. I mean, the beefing up of the NATO presence in the East is not going to go away. It's going to have to be increased, and we're all thinking about it. Our striving for independence from Russian gas and oil is this is a long-term thing. By the way, I would argue that maybe you don't see the effects as much yet in Russia, but Russia has ruined its long-term or medium-term business model, because nobody will want to depend on Russian deliveries anymore. They will end up by having countries that buy a little of them, but nobody after this will want to depend on them anymore. And they will be cut off by so many things. And by now, so many firms will not want to go back to Russia, that it'll really impede the economic development of Russia, which isn't a huge economy to begin with, productive economy.
Right, right. So sitting there in Europe, right in the theater, what is the discussion about Putin's nuclear options? And what is the level of anxiety in Europe about the fact that if he looks like he's going to be beaten or cornered, that he might employ nuclear weapons?
Yeah, the level of anxiety is high. It's high in particular in Germany. or in Europe, where you're closer. Putin disposes, if I'm right, of around half of the world's nuclear weapons, tactical, medium range, and long range weapons. And from what we know, the strategy of the Kremlin doesn't use them in the same way as NATO's strategy as weapons of absolute last resort. It's sort of part of the instrument box, if you want to say. So it is something to worry about. And there are other weapons we'll worry about, biological and chemical weapons. And we've heard Putin and we've heard the Russians talk and accuse Ukraine of using those kind of weapons. Now, this is a well-known pattern. Whenever some people start accusing others, we know that's what they're going to do. And so, yes, that had people very worried. On the other hand, you would think that it is very clear that the use of nuclear weapon will have retaliation. So it is something that would be very, very dangerous for Russia as well. And you do hope for some rationality. You also hope that, again, like in other cases, there's not just one person on the trigger.
It's the primary reason why our prime minister has given for why there's no military engagement in Ukraine, is the potential of a nuclear response. But that potential, as we all know, will exist with Estonia or Poland as well. So how do we, I'm not expecting you to give away state secrets here, but how do we think ourselves out of the box of Putin's nuclear threat?
Well, I think by being very, very credible in our deterrence. I think that's the answer. We need to have a very credible deterrence. We also need to help Ukraine as much as we can to refute and push back the Russian aggression, and that is what is happening here. We have, and the German Chancellor has been very clear about it too. We have said that we will not want to be party to that war. And it is a reasonable thing to do in the sense that it would declare World War III if NATO were to be involved directly. It is a thin line. It is a complicated thing. We know that we are sort of on the border. We're standing there with German troops, by the way, more than 1,000 in Lithuania, next to the Canadians who are in Latvia. We're standing there with our Air Force. We have ships in the Baltic Sea. So all of that is there in a spirit of deterrence.
Herle Burlyites, we've been talking about Easter seals here for the last few weeks. 15% of Canadians are living with a disability, and it's a subject that's close to my heart because my phenomenal brother-in-law, Stephen, is among that 15%. He spends a lot of time with Terry and I, and for that we're grateful. Others aren't so fortunate. Canadians living with disabilities are twice as likely to be victims of violence, and they face significantly higher levels of unemployment than the general population. Easter Seals is Canada's largest provider of financial support programs, services, and issues leadership and development for the disability community. They are a truly unstoppable force in communities all across our country. You can see it and hear it in the work and stories of their ambassadors. Work that includes $50,000 in funded post-secondary scholarships each year, advocacy and awareness when it's needed most, like after a pandemic that completely disrupts society. This year, they're focused on increasing awareness of Easter Seals programs, as well as advocating for the implementation of the Canada Disability Benefit. And camp, one of the best parts of summer and childhood. Every summer, more than 6,000 children and youth living with disabilities attend one of Easter Seal's 17 specialized fully accessible summer camps across Canada. Well, March was officially Easter Seals Month, and a special edition of Easter Seals Month because this year is their 100th anniversary. All year long, Easter Seals is celebrating their volunteers, families, and donors, but also dreaming big and planning for the decades to come. They want to be relevant for the next 100 years. Herle Burlyites, Easter Seals wants you to help celebrate this big birthday too. It's important their good work and the ways they've affected your life gets out there. So please, share your stories of their work in your community on your social channels. Reach out to volunteer in community events. Make a small donation or consider making your company a sponsor. Visit easterseals.ca for all of that, or look for your local chapters on social media. Happy birthday, Easter Seals. Cheers to 100 years. Can we switch to talk about energy maybe a little bit?
Yeah.
So as I understand it, roughly 50% of Germany's gas and about 30% of Germany's oil comes from Russia.
Yeah.
Right. So what's the plan to get off that? What are the options?
Yeah. It's difficult to begin with. It's a real short-term problem. Right now, we're okay. Our sort of, the reserves are okay. But
you are preparing for rationing.
Well, we're preparing for everything. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All options. But right now, as of April, going into the summer season, we're okay. But looking towards October and having filled up for the next winter, having had to fill up for the next winter, there would be a real short-term problem if the Russian gas doesn't continue to flow. We have contingency planning for that, and I don't know the detail of it, but yes, it would be reasonable also to advise people to be economic with natural gas. We have been going out to diversify our sources, and we've managed to get more from our European partners. Norway and others have stepped up. The Americans have been doubling, I think, their natural gas and LNG exports towards Europe. And if I speak about Germany, I'm speaking about a lot of other European states, by the way, because the dependence is similar for a lot of states. We are, and that is the biggest effort of it all. We are going to go into renewables in a way like we've never ever imagined we would. So we are going to make a huge push to be as renewable as we can be in the shortest possible time. Renewable also includes a vast push towards hydrogen. This is by now, I have to say, one of my busiest fields here as an ambassador. We're looking in particular at Canada as a potential superpower on hydrogen. And Germany will be the world's probably best client on hydrogen. So I'm trying to bring those ends together. Now, that won't happen until next year, but it will be hopefully happening over the next 3 to 5 years. And that will be a sea change, turning us towards much, much greater independence, energetic and energy independence, and also working together with partners where we know we can rely upon.
What's Germany's plan to get to net zero? What are the big tools you're employing to get to net zero?
Yeah, well, net zero is for us 2045. I wish it had been 90. 2045, we're committed to do it. You know where the big CO2 users are. And basically buildings are very big. So we're going to have a huge push towards energy efficiency, and we will try and make really the houses that produce as much energy as they consume. Transport is the other one, and we're looking at electrifying, and that again is going to happen a lot faster now. Electrifying transport, at least in the cities, electric vehicles, and then also making transport sustainable by going maybe to hydrogen, or on shipping, going to methanol. There are different methods you can use, but basically go away from fossil fuels on that. Doesn't mean we won't be using fossil fuels to begin with for the foreseeable future. We certainly will. But if you look at the big usages, and I've forgotten industry, steel industry, aluminium industry, these big industries in Germany, there we would look towards hydrogen mostly, to produce enough hydrogen so that they can run net zero as well.
You can't make steel with electricity, right? You need coal.
No, yeah, it's a matter of not coal. Yeah, you need a fossil fuel. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're talking LNG too for the medium term. So that again is a subject of great interest with Canada. And I've just been in Calgary, and I talked to the oil and gas industry in Calgary, who are very committed to reaching their own net zero targets, and who have actually progressed a lot. And we have been talking about trying to get Canadian LNG also to Germany to help bridge that gap. And, it's also when you build new infrastructure on LNG, you can build it in a way that it can be used for LNG to begin with. And then in the transition, it can later be used for hydrogen. And that would be an ideal solution.
Interesting. Does Germany have a carbon tax?
Yes, we do. And we believe it is it's the most efficient instrument in order to get people to save energy. We will also do something like Canada has done, which is have the carbon tax, but give consumers back what they paid into it. This has been copied from the Canadian, and it's in our coalition agreement. And we just had Prime Minister Trudeau meet with Chancellor Scholz about 2 weeks ago. And they have committed to be together in what we call the climate club. So amongst the group of countries who are going to have higher climate ambitions and work together towards finding joint solutions, and also commit to having carbon tax and coordinate on that, because it has international implications.
It's so interesting that you would say that, because one of the questions I wanted to ask you, I mean, Canadians spend a tremendous amount of time worried about our place in the world and what our status is and whether we're invited to the big meetings and not. And anytime there's a slight, we don't get elected to the Security Council at the UN, or Biden convenes 5 members of the G7 and we're not one of them. We're acutely aware of all these things. We know we're a small middle power, but we want to be important. In what contexts does anybody in the rest of the world care what Canada thinks about something?
Well, in a lot of contexts, at least in Germany, I think during the last few years, and that includes the Trump years in the US, also the growing power competition between US and China, and now in particular in this kind of crisis and the COVID crisis, we've realized you need good friends. You need partners that you can rely upon. And I find actually the cooperation has become much closer. And Canada, in that sense, as a partner to Germany, but as a partner also to the EU, matters more. Also, partly because Canada has a lot of the things we need. So the cooperation is one of great complementarity. Canada is part of the G7, an important part of the G7 for us. Canada is also a strategically placed country. You're sort of your north, you're a neighbor to Russia, if you want. Canada does matter. It matters more. And I look back, when I arrived here 5 years ago, where we were on the kind of connections we have, the kind of meetings we have, the visits we have. Also, honestly, the staff they send me, and we're getting more. So I would assume that's a sign of a growing interest. And the growing interest is one of countries we can rely upon when it comes to climate change. We can rely upon when it comes to defending democracy and pluralism and fighting disinformation. But also, like now, when it comes to defending international law and fighting back aggression.
How much more credibility would it buy us? How much more influence could it buy us in the world if we had a stronger military, if we adequately funded a military?
That is a leading question. I think within NATO, we're talking amongst all our friends about what we need to do to increase and to put our military on a better footing. We all have had what we thought was the peace dividend, where we reduced spending for our military, where we reduced the size of our military, Germany foremost. And I think we now realize that...
I think in Canada, we took that peace dividend in the 70s, but... But
I think it's time to regroup. And I mean, Canada's just decided to buy the F-35, and so has Germany. So we're talking about, for example, I just heard it today, reworking together on training. So these things are happening as we speak, yeah.
Right. What does Germany think about China and China's global ambitions? Is that something that you consider to be a threat?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we see China in a triple way. It's a trading partner. It's a global power. It is. But we also see it as a competitor, very much. A competitor not just on the market, but also as a competitor when it comes to the societal systems that we want to promote. And China is also a potential adversary. And we look at the Chinese ambitions and we hear the rhetoric on the South China Sea. We hear what they're saying about Taiwan. And it does fill you with worry, because also you can see that they're building out their presence in the South China Sea. And so there is a real worry there. And again, I think a lot of how we deal with Ukraine will determine on how China will sort of mitigate its ambitions. We thought years and years ago, we thought that, through trade, we would all get closer. We would all sort of sing more and more from the same song sheet. That has not happened. China has a very, very different view of government. It has a very strong hold over its population. It's very controlling. We worry about that too. The closedness of the Chinese information society. And so we have to actually...
Well, it's a real issue with COVID, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we should have known earlier.
Possibly, yeah. Yeah. And also, we thought, we would, through the Open Information Society, our societies would be getting closer. But that hasn't happened because the Chinese have created their own universe. And it's a universe that Western information has a very hard time in piercing. The same is happening, by the way, right now with Russia. And today I just heard that Putin's approval rating is going up in Russia, that is a consequence of this very closed information society where people only hear what the Russian government wants.
I also know what I would say if I lived in Russia and a pollster phoned me and asked me what I thought about Putin. I would have a pretty quick answer to that question at the ready. That's a good point. I was really concerned to see China and India opt out of the global condemnation of Putin.
Yeah.
What interests are they protecting?
Well, in India, I think probably sort of is hanging on to a non-aligned status and also has business interests, very strong military cooperation, but also oil interests with Russia, and so doesn't want to make that difficult. And I think China is in many ways seeing this more in terms of the power competition between China and the US. And so whatever is making life difficult for the United States is in many ways something that China supports. Russia and China also have had in the recent years a very close cooperation, coordination, and support. Still, I wonder how that is going to unfold, because in many ways, I think China is the more powerful partner in that Russia-China partnership, and it probably through the war will increase its power in that relationship.
Do you think Russia becomes like a client state of China?
Might be. Much more, at least.
Right. Now, in that battle for global norms and values and approaches to government and everything that you talked about with China, India is an important hinge country in that global battle, aren't they? I mean, we kind of need them to be a Western country.
Well, I think we were disappointed that India didn't come out in that resolution to condemn the aggression. And I do believe we all have an interest in working with the Indian government very closely, because it is a very important partner, and it would be really good also for all of its own interests, if it was clear on the rules-based order, if it was clear on the principles of the UN Charter.
I've already taken up an hour of your time. Do you have a few more minutes? I've got a couple more questions.
I am fine.
Excellent. Good. I'm so curious about Germany's economy. These are questions I would have asked you if Ukraine hadn't happened and we were still having this conversation. According to what we've been told in North America for the last 30 or 40 years, Germany does everything wrong. You have powerful labor unions, you treat employees as partners, you've got high levels of taxation, you've got generous social safety nets, financial social safety nets for people. Your economy, by our standards, is supposed to be in the dumps, and yet it's always strong. It's usually stronger than ours. What is the secret sauce?
That's a really hardball question. Thank you for that one. So what's the secret sauce? Probably the secret, the top secret is small and medium-sized companies who are very dynamic, who are usually, I think 95%, we all know Siemens and BASF, and these are big and very powerful German companies. 95% of our companies are small and medium-sized, often family-owned companies. These companies are not in for the shareholder value. They are there. Their prime target is, we want the company to do well in the future. which means the companies, the small and medium-sized companies in Germany very often invest heavily into research. They will put their money into the company, invest in the company, invest into research. Where should we be? And the result is that a lot of niche market leaders in the world are small German companies. So that's, I think, one of the backbones. One of the backbones also of the German industry has been a closeness to research. You know, we have a specific institute, Fraunhofer, where companies can go if they have a problem. And Fraunhofer is a scientific institute. So there's a strong connection between science, universities, and industry. So you can actually solve your problems with our universities and translate the research into business. That's another, I think, one of the strengths Germany has. And when you talk about unions, well, German unions are, it's not an adversarial system totally, obviously. Unions defend the employees and the labor side, and they stand up for them. But unions are also part of the economy as big employers themselves. They are also part of the industry. And basically, it makes them want Germany to do well. Basically, they have a vested interest in having the country do well. So our system of negotiation and trying to establish consensus and not go to strikes, but to figure it out without it, has worked with exceptions, but probably better than in other countries. So we had less labor disruptions than most European countries.
Interesting. Okay, thanks. Wild change of subject is the world is seeing an uptick in hate generally, but in anti-Semitism, among other things. And in my judgment, part of that is the fact that the Holocaust is receding in the public consciousness. When I was a kid, and I presume you don't take offense at this, to be honest. When I was a kid, it was held up as the singular example of the evil of humanity that humanity can do. And it was the thing we were supposed to remember about what humans could do to each other. And now I think younger people either don't know about the Holocaust or they have a context for it in which it's one of many genocides that have occurred over history and not particularly notable. Germany goes to some considerable lengths to remember. Can you talk to me about that, why that is, and what the impact of that is, do you think?
Yeah. Let's say Germany in its constitution, when it was constituted, basically the DNA of our constitution is never again. And it has become a DNA, I hope, of our society. And the lesson of the most heinous crime of humanity that Germans committed was translated into having institutions, into having a constitution that begins with the sentence, human dignity is inviolable. And so that's sort of what the society was built on. Germans took a while to realize after the war what they had done. I mean, if you look over the 60s, the 70s, there was a lot of debate and it wasn't an easy thing. But I think once the large population understood what we had committed as a country, and as a nation, there were many, many efforts done in order to find good ways of remembering and actually of repairing as much as you can repair, something like that. And I mean, just an example, we did obviously do with Israel a special relationship, a very special relationship. We did work very hard on a special relationship with Poland. And I mentioned Russia, why we feel sort of we owe them as well. So that's part of it. Also, a culture of
the French asked for it, though, didn't they?
The Franco-German reconciliation was the first, actually, that we took, and it's still one of the most important one for the unification of Europe. The most important relationship for the unification of Europe. But I wanted to, we have by now kind of a culture of remembrance, and I'd love, I mean, we should go through Berlin. And you just walk around. You're in an open air museum of the history of the last, let's say, 120 years. But in particular, when it comes to remembering the Holocaust, you will find these little stones in the sort of metal, and they memorize every family who'd lived there. You will find the place which is empty bookshelves in the ground under a window, which shows where books have been burned. You will walk through the city, and you walk through the Jewish quarters of Berlin, and I could take you on a tour where you actually see that. This is not something we just do in the history books. It's not just something we do in a museum. This is our city. And in the very heart of the city in Berlin, there was this space. It's next to the Brandenburg Gate. And people said, we need to memorize the Holocaust. And there was a long public debate about it. And now there is this very impressive Holocaust memorial right in the heart of the city to show the open road that we won't let here.
So interesting. You know, we don't have to go over on this show what Canada's record is with Indigenous people. We both know what it is, and all of my listeners know what it is. What you're describing in Germany feels unusual mentally. Because, you know, in Canada, with regard to the Indigenous people, we haven't even really started taking accountability for that yet. And we're already tired of being guilty for it. Nobody wants to feel any guilt about that. And the thing you'll hear repeatedly from current generations of Canadians is, it doesn't have anything to do with me. That was done by people decades and decades, generations ago. Why do I have to feel guilty? Why do I have to pay any price to deal with that? And is there no impatience with the guilt in Germany? Don't people sort of want to get past it and get over it and just not have to flagellate themselves all the time?
Oh, there is. I'm absolutely sure there are people who think that way. And yes, passage of time also does something. Absolutely. But when you mentioned now a sort of remembrance and First Nations here in Canada, I just want to tell you a story, if I may, because but I would preface it by saying, you know, history is uncomparable, and you know, I would never ever want to equate anything that happened in Germany with anything else. But how you deal with a difficult a part of your past, that is something we can talk about with Canadians. And the Governor General came on her state visit in October. And she came to the book fair where she presented Canada. It was a beautiful book fair where Canada was the country of focus. But she also made a state visit in Berlin. And her primary focus during that visit was to talk about ways of remembering How does that happen in Germany? And she brought in her delegation a number of representatives of the indigenous communities, one of them the poet laureate, Stargazer. And I do remember one particular poignant moment when we went to the Jewish Museum in Berlin. It's a Liebeskind museum, sort of lots of angles and disturbing a little bit architecture, and it's meant to be disturbing. And we go to this hallway where there's an installation by an artist, and it's all angles and concrete and bare. And you're supposed to cross the hallway. And when you look down, there are huge coins on the floor, thousands of huge metal coins, and every coin is a face, a different face. And you're supposed to walk over it because that's supposed to be the installation, the past. And we couldn't walk over it. And there were people crying because it is it was just briefly after the discovery of those children's graves. It was a very emotional moment. So to talk about good ways of honoring and good ways of remembering and good ways of drawing the lessons was a very important part. And I think the Governor General has a strong vision on what she wants to do.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. Listen, thank you so much, Sabine, for this conversation. So interesting, and you're very forthcoming, and I really appreciate that. And it's great to have you in this country. I know you love Canada, and you're getting to see a fair bit of it. And you'll probably stick around even after your tenure to have some relationship with this country, or you're going to drag your husband back to Germany. One of those two things.
No, I have one leg. I will have one leg in Canada for sure. It's my place, the place I think of when I want to feel really good is a beautiful green Canadian lake. Yeah,
that's weird. Special place in that respect. Listen, it's wonderful to know you. Thank you for doing this. It's been incredibly informative for my listeners and viewers. So I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS. I want to thank our sponsor, CN and Easter Seals, and all of you listeners and viewers out there. And a special thank you, of course, to Sabine Sparwasser for being our guest today. Next week, again, the Herle Burly.
Thank you so much, David.